Hello everyone and welcome to the CEFC Green Room, where today we're exploring the findings of our recently published report, Energising Resource Recovery, the Australian Opportunity. My name is Mac Irvine and I'm your host for today's webinar. Firstly, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the respective lands on which we all meet today, and I would also like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. For those who don't know me, I lead the Waste and Bioenergy Investment Platform at the CEFC. As I'm sure everyone in the audience today will agree, the waste and bioenergy sectors, broadly speaking, are incredibly important both domestically and globally and present significant opportunity with regard to investment, job creation, emissions reduction and general environmental improvement. However, notwithstanding the significant opportunity, it is arguably an underrepresented part of the market, which is why the CEFC continues to support the sector. Notably, to date, the CEFC has invested about $400 million of capital into the sector for a total investment value of about $1.7 billion, and we hope to invest a lot more capital over the next 5 years and beyond to support the up to $7.8 billion investment pipeline identified in the report. To provide a bit of context, the market report was developed with a couple of things in mind. The first was to provide an update on previous market reports the CEFC brought to market, the first in 2015 focusing on bioenergy, and the second in 2016 focusing on energy from waste, and secondly to expand upon these themes to capture a much broader market, including, for example, recycling and resource recovery and everything in between. I'm joined today by Joyanne Manning, both the Circular Economy and Waste and Resource Recovery Leader for Arup across Australasia. Joyanne has extensive experience across both sectors, working as a technical advisor to government agencies and private clients in the development of waste and circular strategy and policy. Joyanne and her team were integral in developing this report and actually provided some support to those earlier reports I mentioned 5 or 6 years ago. Welcome, Joyanne.
Thank you, Mac.
Before getting started, there's just a little bit of housekeeping I'd like to make everyone aware of. So today's formal session will run for about 30 minutes, which is followed by about 10 minutes of Q&A. You can ask questions in the Q&A box on the screen, and if time permitting, we'll attempt to answer questions we have at the end. We'll have a live interactive poll halfway through, so please participate in that if you can. We'll give you a couple of minutes to respond to that. At the end of the webinar, a questionnaire will appear, and we would appreciate your feedback to improve on our future events. So let's get started. So, Joyanne, look, when we approached Arup to undertake this research, I'm interested to get your thoughts on, I guess, what at that point in time, what I guess your initial reaction was to that. Was there a gap in the market? Is it something you thought the market needed? And maybe just before responding to that, I think from our perspective, as I said earlier, we brought out market reports 5 or 6 years ago. Hadn't really seen anyone else in the marketplace bringing that sort of thing to market. And as I said earlier as well, it's still an underrepresented kind of part of the market as well. So, but yeah, keen to get your thoughts on, I guess, your initial reaction to that and how you think it's kind of now going forward.
Thanks, Mac, and good morning, everybody. Yeah, I mean, it was the 2015 and 2016 reports were actually extremely valuable to the market, and they were heavily relied on and referenced, and we would see them often referenced within sort of business cases or development applications, and it really demonstrates the need for evidence and data to underpin decision making, be it from a waste need basis to support planning applications, or very importantly, here we're talking about investment decisions. So yeah, so in terms of, and the market has changed. There has been huge movement both globally and locally, domestically, within the sector on the last 5 years. So we all recognise things like the export bans, the change in the global settings with regard to China, and China soared, and public sentiment. So there's been a real change in public sentiment towards waste. I think a lot of people, we had the war on waste, and we had other programs which really highlighted sort of the public interest in waste and the public demand for a change in our approach to waste management, and underpinned as well with regard to what we're seeing globally with regard to sort of the climate crisis. Obviously, waste is a key output of sort of essentially a linear economy and traditional economy that we have been having over the last sort of couple of hundred years since the Industrial Revolution, and we know it can't sustain, and we know that basically we're in this decade of action, as they call it, and a lot of things have to change. So yeah, so to me it was a clear gap that was needed. It was essentially a no-brainer to when you approached us to assist you in preparing preparing this report to really quantify what was needed in terms of investment in the sector and what the opportunity was, and also what the gaps are. I think that's one of the things that we really highlighted in this report. Yeah,
look, I totally agree. I think it's fair to say that the rationale for us, reaching out to you and developing the report in the first place is to kind of support, what we saw as a gap in the market. And I think it's interesting you mentioned there something we've seen as well, people who are providing, pitch decks to us or, requests for CEFC to support projects and invest in them. We've seen our own report quoted back to us many times. We've also seen, presenting at many conferences or online, virtual meetings and things of that nature. Again, those sort of figures reported back to us. So I think at that time, and it has continued, since 5 years ago, there's obviously been a keen interest in the way that, CEFC is approaching the marketplace, and this is obviously an extension of that, and I think, a lot more detail underpinning that as well, which is good. And I think, we're notwithstanding there's been a fair bit of movement in the last 2 or 3 years around China National's forward, as you say, we're kind of seeing the market moving in the right direction, which is good, and we'll get onto that, in a few minutes, etc.
And I think one of the other things we've really seen as a result of COVID, actually, is waste actually now recognised as an essential service through most states and territories. And the activity in the waste industry, and particularly with regard to some of the mergers and acquisitions that have happened over the last 6 months, has really sort of basically demonstrating that waste is a very attractive market for investors, and it's actually resilient. It's basically things like COVID-proof, and it's sort of resilience-proof. So it's needed, and what we now need to do is make sure that it's as robust and as enabled as possible to deliver a sustainable outcome that, that those of us in the industry are seeking to do, and the communities that we serve.
Yeah, that's a fair point. There's probably not many sectors out there that are pandemic-proof, but as we saw, as you mentioned last year, with the waste sector being deemed an essential service, and I think that there was already interest increasing at that point in time, but it's really accelerated it through the last 12 or 18 months, and we're definitely seeing that from an investor's perspective. And as you mentioned, what's happening publicly with Veolia and Suez and Bingo and Macquarie and all those sorts of names in the marketplace, and I think we'll probably see more of that going forward as well. So, so next, wanting to kind of touch on the investment opportunity. So again, within the report, we've identified an investment pipeline to 2025 of between $4 to $7.8 billion. I think as an investor in the sector who's kind of in it every day, we were aware of probably most of kind of what's going on and had our own view of the sorts of numbers against that, but we were still pleasantly surprised to see at least, in particular the upper end of that range. And I think from 2015, the number at that time was about $5 billion, so we're getting an extension on that. So, but yeah, keen to get your views on, as someone in the marketplace, but perhaps not with that same investor-focused lens as us, what your thoughts are around that. Was it surprising to you? Was it as expected? Have you had any other feedback from market around that and the potential?
No, I mean, I was pleasantly surprised as well, but I think it was in a realistic surprise way. We get approached, and we obviously are very active in the market, and we know how many people are interested in this market, and there's constantly projects, people coming to us for projects. There's a lot of increasing international interest, I think, in Australia as well. And again, I think it's not, I think for a lot of the advanced waste treatment technologies, it's, we're not in a mature stage, it's not saturated, so therefore, and there's also been a number of different policy levers and different things that have happened that are enabling the market here as well. So it's kind of it's all, the trajectory of it is all moving in the right direction. We do recognise that, in the report as well, that a significant proportion of the potential investment opportunity is from energy from waste, but that's really because of things like the scale, the size, and the cost of the energy from waste projects. So the two which are under development in WA, which are essentially the benchmark, are both sort of at least $500 million. So it doesn't take many to get you up to a sort of a big number. But I think what's more important is to look at the other opportunities. So we see now from a federal government target point of view is looking to reduce the amount of organics in landfill by 50% by 2030, aligned with the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and we're seeing it coming through all the state strategies as well, looking to separate out organics. And when we look then to what is the investment potential for organics, I believe it is really significant. And just we talked about this already, but we look to sort of benchmarking that. We've got things like you can talk to the Secure project is what.
Yeah, so for those who aren't familiar, so the CEFC was a sole lender to an investable composting facility in Victoria that was led by the Thesea Group. So that has a total processing capacity of about 120,000 tonnes per annum, and that's a FOGO waste stream coming from councils. That has a total project cost of about $65 million or so.
Yeah. And here up in Queensland, we have the Phoenix facility, which was developed by J.J. Richards just south of Brisbane in Yatala, which is a throughput of about 45,000 tonnes and an investment of approximately about $20 million for that. And also in terms of future investment potential, it's sort of about 9 or 10 million to double the throughput on that. And that again is it's an invest of composting, and that's to look at sort of servicing the South East Queensland Council. So it's for MSW or municipal solid waste coming from the councils. And then we also through business cases, we see a wide range of potential opportunity with regard to anaerobic digestion. So we have co-located anaerobic digestion for things like for agriculture or potentially some industrial processing, which would have some of the chicken farms and things like that, which I think are usually more around the 10 to 20 million. I think is right. Is it?
It all depends on scale and throughput, but I think that the general comment there is probably it's a smaller scale opportunity, smaller investment quantum for those sorts of projects.
Yeah. And then what we have then is larger scale, sort of anaerobic digestion, and some of them are being proposed, like what we have down in Victoria with the Yarra Valley Water Project, I think, which is about 35 million, which is co-located with a wastewater treatment plant. And then we're involved in some business cases where we see potentially bigger anaerobic digestive facilities, could be anywhere between sort of 50 to 100 million, depending on size and scale. And then, so that's sort of looking at the organics. So, and I think the great opportunity with regard to that organic sector is that, yes, it deals with volume of organics, but we're starting to see it also enables real value. Yeah. So what we have is we're enabling a high quality compostable material, which then can provide value to the land, and it provides positive impact when we're looking to regenerate sort of our natural systems, which is a key thing for the circular economy. And for the anaerobic digestion plants, it's providing essentially clean energy, renewable energy, either locally if it's a co-located facility or back into the grid.
Yeah. So, and I think that's a really important point around the flexibility of bioenergy as well. So it has obviously the ability to generate electricity, heat, gas, or even fuels. And so not only the flexibility of the output source, but also I think the baseload or dispatchable nature of it as well, which other certain technologies aren't able to provide and have intermittency challenges. So I think there's a whole raft of reasons why, obviously I'm in the sector and understand it pretty well, but for anyone on the audience today who's not familiar with that, we do touch on that within the report, so it's worth having a look at that as well, to talk about, understand the flexibility and I guess the importance of that. So,
and I think then the other key area, the other key sort of sector or part of the industry we saw, which is obviously directly related to the materials that are subject to the export ban, which got impacted by China's sword, is this sort of essentially the paper, card, plastics, glass, tires, and sort of investment there. And what we're seeing is I see two sets of investments there. One is with regard to essentially the preparation and the processing capacity for that. So this is more advanced and more sophisticated material recycling facilities. This last week, a new facility was opened up in Cairns, which was co-funded through Cairns Regional Council, the federal government, and Regroup, which is about $14 million. And then we're seeing and we know there's other projects through this co-funding arrangement from the federal government and the state government and also private investors. So you're seeing this, essentially 3-to-1 basis of that. So there's a number of advanced material recycling facilities. We've got the new best and biggest in the world Bingo Industries facility, MPC2, 110 million, the largest, the most sophisticated one in the world, now sitting in Australia. I'm very proud it's Irish technology, so I have to get that in. But that's one extreme. But we're also seeing it the whole way down through to the more, sort of that 10, 15 million. Which we'll see sort of much more aligned to sort of essentially for council related, local government related. So there's going to be a large number of them. So they add up. And then when the material has been so essentially processed, and also what's coming through container refund scheme, which is again presenting a very clean stream. We're starting to see projects like the Clean Away Asahi Pact project, which which is looking at reprocessing and manufacturing recycled plastic and high quality food grade recycled plastic, which I think is in and around that 40-45.
Yeah, I think that's publicly been announced at about a $45 million project cost. But I think importantly on that one too, rather than just thinking about project costs or investment opportunity or the 25 to 28,000 tonne per annum processing capacity, if you then think about what does that mean from a bottles perspective, it's equivalent to about 1 billion PET bottles. So you think about all those bottles that are going to be reprocessed or remanufactured into recycled content that potentially could otherwise have gone into a water stream or your general litter or whatever it might be as well. So I think there's a whole raft of broader ESG considerations to these sorts of projects as well, which again, as an investor, a clean energy investor in the space, we're very conscious of, as I'm sure most of the audience is too. So there's, I guess the way I see it is it's kind of win-win-win-win-win across the board.
And I think what's great in that space as well is that we're actually we're getting supported through APCO and others for extended producer responsibility, and there was only the new ANZ Pact agreement announced last week through APCO, looking again cementing that demand for all plastics and all packaging to be either recyclable, compostable, or recoverable or biodegradable. I think by 2025. So again, it's the system is working. I think is what the point.
Look, anyway. Totally agree, and not wanting to talk out of school here with an engineer expert in the room, but I think from the energy from waste perspective, the large-scale thermal as well, I think what people probably don't, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but what some people may not recognise is, I guess, the very high level of sophistication and complexity, and I guess I've heard numbers anecdotally around 1/3 of the cost and 1/3 of the size of the plant is for emission scrubbing to make sure, and again, you'll absolutely talk to this better than I can, but these, as I said, are very highly sophisticated projects to ensure that the environmental impact is minimal. But I'm not sure if you have any comments around that.
Yeah, well, I mean, a bit of a rule of thumb, and look, it depends on whether you want to put a ski slope on it or not, but if you take a sort of a more normalised building form, and I'm not saying it's not architecturally treated, but you're looking at essentially the building and the civil costs and being about 30%. And the technology and the process being 70.
Wow.
So,
okay.
yeah. So, the money on these plants goes into the technology. It doesn't, like I said, unless you want to ski slope. I think on that one, it ended up being about 50-50, but it was over $1 billion Australian dollars, that plant. And it was not, so the cost of these being, north of 500 million is you're looking at 350 million of that going in to technology costs. Yep. Which is very, very, very significant, and they are very advanced. They are very sophisticated. They operate on very complex SCADA systems, and the number of emission point, how they are monitored, etc., are complex pieces. And they also, they have like this South Australia's figure is still quoted from, I think, a report from 2012-13, which is those 2.3 jobs when you landfill, for every 10,000 tonnes versus 9.8 in the advanced. Yeah. A typical large-scale waste-to-energy plant will, which deals with about 300,000-400,000 tonnes. It's about 60 jobs just alone in the facility.
Some operations plus hundreds of during construction and indirect jobs.
You're needing a lot more people and a higher. And a more advanced, higher value jobs as well. So, people, with higher levels of
skilled labour.
Yeah.
Great. So that's, we've kind of touched on it in the last two discussion points, but I think it's worth having a chat now about some of the key policy drivers. So we've mentioned, obviously, China National Sword, export bans, etc. And again, for those who haven't looked at the report yet, there's a really kind of beautifully presented two-page layout, which looks at kind of what's happened pre-China Sword, which, to be fair, is not very much. But then obviously in the last 3 years, we've seen significant momentum building in the sector. But interested in your thoughts around the key policy drivers, either touching further on what you've already mentioned or perhaps some others in there as well. And I think what you see really driving the industry forward from, investment, jobs, emissions reduction, and just, I guess, the the broader environmental impact as well.
So I think what we have is when I'm going to talk in some ways towards start to talk about the circular economy and circularity. But what we really need is we need circularity for to sort of enable sort of our investments and our infrastructure, and that often comes from things like having the right policy settings, having sort of enabling through our policy and our and how we operate our systems. So through things like source segregation and how we do that. That provides us with the sort of the ability to do it. But then we also need the infrastructure, to support these circularity. And if we don't, we have one without the other, the system doesn't work. And actually something, which is really important with regard to this is something like actually when we think about it, is our right to repair. So if we don't when we start thinking, and particularly when we're starting to kind of create that value, if we actually are not allowed to repair things and we don't have that right to repair, it's actually, there's a breakdown. So what will happen is that we don't end up repairing and we end up buying new. Yeah. And actually from a European basis that kind of underpins the Green Deal, actually that right to repair is quite fundamental, and that's where we're starting to see a lot of investment in that. And actually that right to repair actually extends back up the line, back up to extended producer responsibility, because if we actually make the producer responsible for longer, we require them to allow us to essentially repair the item as well. So so they actually need to give us the information. They actually need to allow us the ability to do that. So that's sort of one sort of things around extended producer responsibility and the right to repair. I think one of the other key things to me then is actually, and it's sort of a key driver, is actually around land use planning and making sure that we have the ability. We now recognise waste as an essential service, but we need to make sure that we actually can have waste infrastructure and not really, really remote, that we actually have waste infrastructure supporting the communities and the environment that it's serving. So otherwise we end up sort of with negative consequences. So if we end up having to ship everything out very, very far away, we obviously have we end up increasing significant transportation costs, which adds significant financial burden onto projects, and therefore then often they have difficulties.
And just sorry to jump, but just on that point, so look, we have discussions with local councils, state government, federal government, ourselves, etc., and even project developers. And I think one of the challenges for developing projects is the best place to locate a facility. So different states approach their approvals processes differently, different local councils, etc. And I think what we've discussed with people in the past is there a role for councils or government, whoever it might be, to say, well, actually we're going to hold a parcel or parcels of land in a certain area that are well connected, or for all the reasons you mentioned. Are you having discussions yourself with developers or councils and those sorts of things about what role they could play to support that?
Yeah, no, we are, and we're starting to see. I think what's actually probably really, really important is this co-location. So it's not having. I think councils recognise there needs to be, sort of waste infrastructure, but often they want them isolated. So what we're now saying to them, what we're now seeing is more maturing of the conversation is actually, actually makes more sense to be able to co-locate. Mm-hmm. So can we co-locate a material recycling facility within a circular economy precinct? So therefore, the outputs of that material recycling facility can be utilised, sort of across the rest of the precinct through remanufacturing, and rather than having a material recycling facility and then having to transport everything, 200 kilometres before you can actually do something of value with it. So and things like the special activation precincts in New South Wales have recognised the opportunity for waste and material and the resource recovery infrastructure as part of those. Obviously, in a safe, obviously we have to be very cognizant of the potential environmental impact and and making sure that there is going to be no adverse impacts to the environment or human health, through it. And I know, from conversations, for instance, with the New South Wales EPA, that's something, how do they, and how do you license these facilities if they're, within the right environment, etc., and making sure that, that you want obviously don't have to license the whole precinct. You want to just be able to license the actual process or the facility. So it's complex. I think what's comforting to see is that certainly you're seeing the state governments and the regulatory agencies, considering this and moving their thinking towards how this happens.
Yeah. Okay. No, fascinating. Thank you. And I think as an extension of that, keen to get your view, given I guess your experience globally, Arup's experience globally, etc. So maybe some examples you've seen in other countries that Australia should consider. And I think both from a policy perspective potentially, but also like from that kind of, eco precinct style of land use planning. Is there anything within either of those or both of those that you're seeing globally that you think is kind of, best in class, or key learnings or key takeaways that Australia should consider going forward as well?
Yeah, no, I mean, look, there's some great examples across the world. I think, Europe is always held up as leading the way here. They're definitely
Ireland in particular, or just...
No, I'm not going to mention Ireland, actually. But Europe in terms of, Europe but Europe's in a different position. They have different drivers. They are, you've got a lot of people living in a very small area. They are very resource constrained, so they know in terms of so they very much recognise in Europe the finite basis of some key resources. I mean, someone told me recently that if you want to build a road in the Netherlands, your nearest quarry is Norway. So, it's a big incentive to recycle, as much construction, and demolition material as possible, because you don't want those transportation costs. And obviously, the Europeans have for a very long time, through their landfill directive and through and obviously the circular economy directive that came out in 2015, really shifting that reliance away from landfill and supporting a circular economy and the recycling and resource recovery industry. But what's interesting in Europe is how it's transferred down into the member states and the different in the different nations and countries. And even if you look to the UK, you've got obviously you now are actually out because of Brexit, but you've seen Wales and Scotland really sort of going making huge advancements with regard to this. And I'd say is for both Wales and Scotland, it really came down from a sort of a centralised government basis and a very sort of supportive, enabling regulatory system, particularly Scotland. If you look to the Scottish Environment Protection Agency, who actually has an Australian at their helm, the CEO is Terry Ahern. He came out of SV. But in terms of their collaborative approach to the industry and their collaborative regulatory approach, and they very much go in of going, okay, we want to work with industry to have a really good outcome, and also but having the full weight and suite of of the legal regulatory environment that they have, but that's not their default. Yeah. They're very much working collaboratively, and they're signing things like, industry collaborative agreements and having that ability to have test facilities and to innovate, do lab scale experiments, etc. So it's really good. I mean, the Netherlands, Denmark, Belgium always held up, as really, having really high rates of resource recovery, recycling, but again, and what you're seeing, particularly the Netherlands, is very interesting in terms of they're really moving forwards in terms of enabling sort of data and sort of that digital technology and requiring things like everything now requires a digital twin. You have to demonstrate, like if you want to build a new building, and now in like a large scale building in Amsterdam, you have to basically demonstrate how you're going to use another building to be a material bank for your new building.
Okay.
So there, but I'd like to mention also, like, nearer to home, somewhere like Singapore, which very, very different to Australia, tiny little nation, sitting on the edge of a peninsula. But their drive is very much carbon related, and they're seeing it from and also from an autonomy basis, because they are really small, and they've seen even things like in COVID, they've realised that importing 95% of their food is not is a bit challenging for them. But you're seeing it very much from a waste point of view as well, and a recycling and a resource recovery point of view, them starting to sort of change their thinking, and obviously their very high reliance on energy from waste, seeing what, they recognise that that's something they have done, but they're also recognising they have to look to sort of far more advanced recycling and particularly around organics.
Interesting. Okay. Conscious we've got about 6 minutes or so until we get into the Q&A section, so there's just 2 more to get through if we can. So the next one relates to technology and innovation and how it can be applied to the sector. So I think the way that the CEFC's historically looked at this is, I guess, a typical investment thesis of proven technology with proven feedstock at proven scale globally, recognising that Australia is, a bit behind the 8 ball, so to speak, in the sector broadly, but certainly as relates to application of certain technologies. But interested, I guess, in your thoughts around the technology piece as well as the interplay with innovation and the role that, for example, you or industry sees CEFC, ARENA or other, grant-making bodies playing to support the industry broadly.
Yeah. So innovation is really important in terms of continuing, and it's something which does underpin. Australia has always been at the forefront of a lot of sort of innovation and technology advancement. However, we also, from a waste point of view, particularly for large scale, particularly we talk of energy from waste. I mean, there's the CEFC have been very open in terms of that they in terms of for them to consider investment, it needs to be tried and tested, proven technologies with demonstrated performance that can be evidence based, and that's really important to the social license for these plants. These facilities are they're large facilities. They're providing an essential service to our communities, but we also need to have absolute confidence that they are not going to impact either planet or people. But having said that, we can't negate future advancements and innovation and technology. So I love where ARENA plays in this, and I think ARENA have been actually quite sort of instrumental in supporting a number of projects, and we've seen sort of a number of tar projects, for instance, and glass recycling projects, and things like the Northern Oil project here in Gladstone, and that's all been developed through sort of support by ARENA and the private sector. And we need and what we then need to do is then sort of really work out how do we take sort of essentially like a lab scale or sort of a demonstration scale, and how do we scale it, and how do we provide that comfort to scale. I think, but we, so for instance, Blocktex, which is a Brisbane-based, Australian-based firm with regard to textile recycling, and I see now that they're advancing their first full-scale facility, and they have been operating at sort of a test scale for quite a few years.
Yeah, no, interesting. I think, and look, echoing those comments, I think the CEFC absolutely can look at any projects and all projects. I think, as I said, the typical investment thesis relates to that proven nature of technologies, feedstock scales, but at the same time, the role that we play in the marketplace is to be supporting more innovative projects or technologies as well, subject to the commercial parameters we have around all of that. But yeah, look, I totally agree with that sentiment. We've got a few minutes left, and so we're actually going to do a CEFC green room first here, and we're going to be pushing out a poll to each of you in the audience, and this actually looks at what we're basically wanting to achieve here is looking at the audience's top 3 key factors driving investment in the sector. So again, for those of you who've seen the report, you'll see a top 10 within the report. For those of you who haven't, you'll obviously have a chance to look at that later on. But as I say, this poll will be going out to the audience now, but as we're giving the opportunity for the audience to respond to that, Joanne, keen to get your thoughts on the top 3 you see coming from that report.
Yeah, I mean, they're all very, very important, I think, and that's why they're all in the top 10. To me, policy drivers is absolutely critical, and consistent policy drivers is what I would like to, which I think is really important as well, because I used to, a few years ago actually, I presented at a conference in London, and I put up a map of Australia, and I got 25 million people, and I think I had a picture of Vegemite and a kangaroo and something else, and I said, yeah, but when it comes to essentially policy and the waste and recycling industry, you need to think about it as 8, because it's a massive barrier to entry, because if you're an international company and you're used to working in, like, you're a Japanese company and you've got a population that you're servicing of 140 million, and next thing you're breaking 25 million down into 8, you sort of start to go, well, is it worth, am I going to get my return on investment to be doing this? So consistent policy drivers across the country, I think is fundamental, and it is really good to see the federal government coming into the space and having through the National Waste Policy and Plan, providing this high-level guidance to all the states and territories, and we're seeing COAG as well. Through COAG, actually it being transferred and transcribed down into the states and territories, which is essentially, if you think of, that's how the European Union works. Mm-hmm. They have a European directive which all the member states are required to transcribe into their sort of local legislation and regulation. So yeah, I think that's really good, and I think more needs to happen. We really do need to see, and this is part of my circularity for infrastructure for circularity, but resource recovery, market development, and quite explicit support and investment into that. Yeah. And that's everything from specifications and standards to enable actual sort of the processing capacity, market development to provide that market surety through procurement, and then actually through operation, and really having to. That's very much a systemic approach. That's not just one. So that's not just one piece of that. That all has to work.
The whole broader market development.
And to provide people. I think there's great appetite to use recycled content and reuse recycled materials, but if they don't think that they can get that security of supply because we don't have the infrastructure, we don't have the infrastructure capacity, or there's potentially an issue with regard to the availability of the material coming through, etc. It will break down. Yeah. And the last one is, and it's probably it's probably 4 and 6 are similar in terms of that resilient supply chain. So it's through that, and so I think that's
okay. Top 3. So I think good question. So policy drivers for me is probably the key one. I think that we've seen other parts of the market, like as an example, the renewable energy target in Australia. We've seen ARENA putting $100 million or so towards the solar sector. Historically, we've seen just how quickly that sector was able to move, and so I think that if there were certain drivers enabling certain parts of the market within Australia to really accelerate, I think that would absolutely be critical. I think we're already seeing that though. So the recycling modernisation funding that's coming through in the Modern Manufacturing Initiative, the COAG export bans, there's all these sorts of things happening at the moment, which we've obviously identified in the report as well. But I think that's a critical one. I think landfill levies for me actually, which I think is probably part of that policy decision making as well. So I think the fact that most states and territories are either implementing a levy where they previously didn't have one, or increasing that year on year, is actually sending an economic signal to the market that, two signals. One, economically, projects can be more viable now from an economics and commercial perspective, but also that you're creating an alternative to landfill, so it's a much better environmental outcome at the same time. So the other one I had is bioenergy being a flexible energy source, and I think it's something I touched on earlier, but as I said, I guess my personal view is it's definitely underrepresented within the Australian marketplace, and the fact that you have the ability to provide, depending upon the technologies, etc., but multiple outputs, being electricity, heat, gas, and fuels, as well as the dispatchability and baseload nature, and being co-located behind the meter. So there's a whole raft of reasons why I think that should be better represented in the marketplace, or better understood. And I think that if you have that understanding with, certain policy drivers being implemented, I think that's absolutely going to lead to ultimately what my role is in the market, to future investments and supporting industry more broadly, which I think is critical. So I'm interested now to see what the poll results are. So we might go to that section if we can. So interestingly, policy drivers was the biggest at about 80%. We then had landfill levies at 40%, so good to see everyone following me. Thanks, everyone. And then behind that, we had a number at about 25 to 30%, so circular economy polled very highly there. Resource recovery market development, as you mentioned, was kind of 35%, and the flexibility piece that I mentioned at 27%. So I think it's safe to say that the top 10 are a top 10 for key reasons, and I think a lot of them have an interplay and working well together. But interesting there to see, as I said, maybe just to reiterate for the group, if they're not able to see it, policy drivers being the highest, landfill levies at 40% next, and then I think it was Resource Recovery Market Development 34. So thank you all for joining that poll. Very interesting to see that, particularly as a first of a kind for the CFC. So we might move into the Q&A section now. So look, I'll just go through the list quickly and see a couple here. So the first one says, where does the CFC see the next big thing for your investments in this sector? What is at the top of the CFC's investment list? So I think there are probably two ways to answer this. The first is that we're ultimately responding to market. So, we're not project developers, we're ultimately investors in the space. But I think what Joyanne and I have already talked about is that investment pipeline opportunity in terms of the most dollars going towards a certain sector is likely to be large-scale energy from waste for obvious reasons we mentioned earlier around the size, the scale, the sophistication of the technologies, etc. And I think it's fair to say there's a number of projects already under development in the Australian marketplace, particularly on the eastern seaboard. Obviously, CEFC is a lender to both the Kwinana Energy from Waste project, or Abitas Energy as it's now known, as well as the East Rockingham Waste to Energy facility. And obviously we see ourselves as having a broader role in supporting more projects going forward. So I think that's probably the next big thing, so to speak, but the reason being it's really a case of the most dollars being applied to that. But we absolutely are looking at other investment opportunities across, as I said, resource recovery, recycling, smaller scale bioenergy, whatever it might be. Also particularly noting that we've got the Australian Recycling Investment Fund, which was mandated in December 2019, and looking at a number of opportunities there as well. So that's probably the best way to answer that. The next one we've got here, another one for me, is can you share with us what institutional investors can be thinking about when it comes to these investments? So I think it's probably a number of things. So the first is the resilience of the sector and the essential service nature of it, and that goes just beyond collections or traditional, waste management processes. I think that, the renewables market, generally speaking, is more of an energy output or energy revenue generating type of project, shall we say, whereas waste-derived projects actually have the ability to have a diversified revenue stream. So the fact that you can actually create revenues from gate fees, i.e. processing waste and being the alternative to landfill, can be really interesting for institutional investors as well. There's also, I guess, a concept of a portfolio approach. So look, it's fair to say that there's probably less appetite to do one or two $10 to $20 million projects, but if there's appetite to think about a portfolio approach of the smaller scale projects, so if you wrapped up between 5 and 10 AD projects, for example, and created a portfolio that might be anywhere between $1 and $300 million, I think that's really of interest as well. And it's really, again, diversifying, your scale of projects, diversifying the level of risk, because if one of those didn't go so well, then you've got multiple other projects to support your diversity of kind of portfolio allocation and those sorts of things. So there's a whole raft of reasons why I think that would be really important, for institutional investors to consider. And I think we've identified a lot of those in the report as well.
And I think I really like that idea of a portfolio investment approach when you get more economies of scale, because there is a lot of commonality in what you'll need to demonstrate and what you look at when you're looking at investment decisions, and things like this report hopefully provide a lot, some support of some of the information they need to provide it. So if you're only doing it for one, it's going to, from an economies of scale point of view, you're going to put a lot of work into it, but it can support a number of projects. And also I think as a lot of the time waste is not, it changes. We know it's dynamic, it's moving, and this is what it's one of the reasons why it is it's such an interesting sector, and it's an interesting industry to work in. But actually, by having a portfolio, you can actually provide information and evidence and data to support others. And I actually Regroup are quite interesting in this. We can talk to Regroup in a second. I don't know if they're on the call, but I know, for instance, that they utilise their data across their portfolio of material recycling facilities to enhance performance. So so when potentially essentially something as simple as a new product comes along because the washing up liquid bottle has changed, and they have the ability to sort of basically communicate and transfer that knowledge, so it doesn't impact the performance of their plants as much. So when they see changes in one plant, they can have the opportunity to perform in others. So if you're operating sort of a portfolio of sort of composting facilities or recycling facilities, whatever, you have the ability to sort of operate them, and actually get enhanced performance by treating them more like a portfolio rather than being one-off.
Yeah, totally agree. I think the other thing too is that, and I think you touched on it there, is that For any new investors into the sector, there is a fair bit of work that goes into diligencing and understanding the different markets and the fact that, Australia has a number of different states and territories which think about landfill levies differently and approvals processes differently. So if you're entering the market, having that kind of portfolio approach and being able to apply that lens across a number of projects, a number of investments, means that not only are you kind of better placed to make those investments, but you'll kind of get better at it, gradually as well. And that'll inform the marketplace. But it's interesting that you mentioned around taking the portfolio approach from data and those sorts of things. So another one has come through here. 1 second. So this is probably an extension of the question around institutional investment. So it says, does the CEFC think that waste recycling investments are mispriced from a risk perspective in the Australian context? And if so, does it give investors the opportunity to earn outsized returns relative to other sectors? So I think the short response is it absolutely has the opportunity to. I think obviously these are complex projects, a lot of variables going into them, multiple feedstocks, technologies, outputs, etc. But I think that something we've seen in the work we've done and talking to people with international expertise and those sorts of things is that subject to kind of getting it right, so to speak, in the Australian marketplace, there absolutely is the ability to earn outsized returns compared to what global jurisdictions might otherwise consider. I think it's also worth noting that, thinking about other parts of the energy market, so renewables more generally, whether that be wind or solar or otherwise, etc. There is inherently an additional level of risk, I guess you could say, given the level of complexity. But if you can pull those projects together in the right way and make sure you're managing all the risks appropriately, I think you're absolutely going to see an increased return as compared to other sorts of investments. And again, it goes to portfolio construction, because if you've got some renewables, more general renewables, shall we say, you might have other investments in generalist infrastructure. Waste kind of plays both of that role, being infrastructure plus waste plus energy plus the gate fee revenues generated as well. So I think it's definitely an interesting one from that perspective.
Just one of the things on that. I mean, I absolutely agree with you, and I think if you look to the European market and other places, it's getting quite saturated as well. So there's probably not that much room. There's a lot of room here. But one of the things I'd really think is one of the things is really important that the industry needs to do more is actually inform and educate other actors and other people that are needed sort of across, to deliver these projects. So for instance, I'm thinking even just in terms of the construction industry, spending the time to inform sort of civil contractors and other contractors and and even things like sort of steel manufacturers, or if you think of an energy from waste plant, there is a lot of steel that goes into it. So or welding, or it doesn't matter what it is. The industry can sometimes be sort of a bit closeted, and it really needs to take a lot of time. I was only speaking recently to a large, to a civil contractor. They were asking me what's coming and what's new and whatever, and I said, well, actually, we're going to start seeing a lot of investment in FOGO and opportunities there. You think about it, a composting facility, it's a lot of civils. That's what it is. And then it's like, okay, how can I understand that? How do I learn about that? And it's trying to sort of spend that time to educate and inform.
Yeah, it's a really broad ecosystem, I guess you could say, of all the actors within them. I totally agree. We've just come up to time, so look, quickly, first of all, I want to say thank you, Joyanne, for joining us today. I think it was a really good discussion. Hope all of the audience obviously thought it was really well informed as well. And thank you to the audience for dialing in, obviously. The recording will be made available after the webinar, and if people could please complete the survey, which will appear at the end of the screen, that would be greatly appreciated to enable us to ensure that we're improving these sorts of sessions going forward. But otherwise, thank you so much. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good day.